Ezekiel Holt was no stranger to silence. For years after the war, he lived out on the open plains, where the wind howled in long, hollow waves, a reminder that man was nothing but dust. His ranch stood alone on the wide land, fences leaning, the horse barn quiet most days. He rose before dawn, worked until the sky burned red at dusk, then fell into a heavy sleep. Each day was the same, until one autumn morning, a letter arrived. The paper was yellowed, the handwriting familiar. Jeremiah Clark, an old comrade turned preacher in Kansas. Jeremiah wasted no words. He wrote of a woman named Miriam Hayes, a young widow left behind with nothing but scornful stares and hard days ahead. Jeremiah's words were plain. Ezekiel, you once told me you had nothing left to hold on to. But I believe, if anyone deserves a chance to begin again, it is her. And if anyone is steady enough to offer it, it is you. Ezekiel sat a long time with that letter in his hand. His calloused fingers trembled, not from the draft slipping through the door, but from something long dormant rising in his chest: responsibility. He knew Jeremiah did not ask lightly, and Ezekiel knew too. The empty house could not be warmed forever by ghosts of war. On a rattling stagecoach rolling down a dusty road, Miriam Hayes pulled her faded shawl tighter around her shoulders. The distance wearied her body, but it was the weight inside her chest that hollowed her eyes. Each jolt over a rut brought back the past, her husband's growl, the long days of forced obedience, the gnawing loneliness that clung like a shadow. Folks said she was fortunate when sickness took him, but Miriam felt only emptiness. Freedom had come too late, leaving scars deeper than chains. The wind slipped through the cracks of the coach, carrying the scent of sun-scorched earth. Miriam shut her eyes, swallowing dry. She knew little of the man called Ezekiel Holt, save for Jeremiah's words. A quiet man, but a just one. Was that enough? She could not be certain. Yet there was no path back, only the red-dusted road that led to a stranger's ranch. When the wheels finally stopped, Miriam opened her eyes to a stretch of land before her. A plain wooden house, porch weathered pale, the earth beneath cracked and hard. It spoke of harshness, yet it was the only place willing to take her in. The driver set her luggage down quick and left without a word. Dust rose in his wake, leaving Miriam alone, her chest tight. The door creaked open. Ezekiel Holt stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, hair streaked gray and tousled by wind. His eyes were the color of ash, steady but unreadable. Miriam froze a moment. There was no softness in his stance, but there was control, enough to make her feel distance, not danger. They studied one another in silence. Ezekiel said nothing, only stepped forward and took the worn wooden trunk left by the driver. Miriam almost clutched it back, but his rough hand closed firm, as if carrying burdens was second nature. A sudden gust tore across the yard, tugging Miriam's shawl from her shoulders. She stumbled to catch it, and his hand, large, weathered, was there first. Miriam placed her smaller hand in his, only to steady herself, yet the moment rooted them both. Skin touched skin. One hand, once marked by cruelty, now trembled at a touch absent of threat. One hand, long used to steel and cold, was startled to find warmth still alive. Miriam pulled back, heart pounding. Ezekiel shifted half a step away, his gaze breaking. No words passed between them. Only the wind carried through the old fence, scattering dust across the yard. That brief moment, awkward and unspoken, was the beginning of a journey neither of them could have foreseen. The ranch door shut behind them, leaving only wind and dust outside. Miriam stood in the main room, her eyes roaming over a space untouched by any woman's hand. The wooden walls were dull and darkened, the long table scarred with knife marks, a corner stacked with sacks of oats coated in dust. No curtains, no flowers, no sign of a home warmed by family. Ezekiel set her trunk on the floor, the thud echoing in the empty room. He turned, his hand motioning down the hall. "Mother's room," his voice rasped, short and flat. Miriam nodded, stepping into the small chamber. A window opened to the wide sea of grass. A simple wooden bed draped with a quilt frayed at the edges. On the table by the bed, a candle half burned still lingered, as if the one who once lived there had just stepped out. Miriam laid her hand on the quilt, feeling something unfamiliar rise within. The chance to rest without someone watching over her shoulder. When she returned to the main room, she found Ezekiel tending the fire in the hearth. The flames flickered across the deep lines of his face. He pulled dried meat from the cupboard, a crust of bread, and set a black pot over the heat. Every move was efficient, practiced, yet drained of any joy. Miriam stood still a moment, then quietly fetched water from the barrel, rinsing the greens with careful hands. At the table, silence hung heavy. Ezekiel pulled out a chair across from her, placed an extra spoon at her plate. A clumsy but deliberate act, marking that this table was no longer for one. Miriam bowed her head, her hands trembling slightly as she tore bread. She was not used to anyone leaving room for her. In her last marriage, the table had been a place of orders, not care. She raised the food to her mouth, chewing slow. The hush was so deep, the clink of metal against the bowl carried sharp. Ezekiel never lifted his eyes, but sometimes glanced up, brief and searching, as if to confirm she was truly there in this house long barren of presence. Miriam felt it, and without thought, lifted her gaze. For a breath, their eyes met. Ezekiel's look was not cold, as she had feared. There was weariness in it, yes, but also a question, a searching. Like a man making sure the figure before him was not a shadow. Miriam's chest tightened, her pulse quickened, and she lowered her eyes. Yet the image of that look stayed, making the bread in her hand harder to swallow. They ate on in silence. Only once did Ezekiel push the plate of meat toward her, his eyes down, his voice steady. "Eat more." Her reply was quiet. "Thank you." Nothing more. No stories, no sharing. Yet for Miriam, it was enough to stir something strange. The taste of care without demand. When the meal ended, Ezekiel cleared the dishes, not letting her touch them. He moved with quiet resolve, never looking her way. But Miriam understood. It was distance he meant to keep. On her way back to her room, she paused at the doorway to the porch. The thin moon hung above, its pale light spilling across the fields. She pulled her shawl close and drew a long breath. The silence here was stark, but not the silence of threat. No growl, no shadow of death, only silence pure and still. In her room, Miriam sat on the bed, her hand resting on the wooden trunk. She thought of Ezekiel's gesture, laying a spoon before her. Seemingly small, yet it brushed the oldest wound in her soul. Beyond her door, Ezekiel sat by the dying fire, staring into the dark. He remembered the moment Miriam's eyes had lifted to his. It had been a long time since anyone's gaze had held his, if only for a flicker. It left him uneasy, but also with a faint, fragile thread of hope. The night passed in quiet. But for them both, that quiet was no longer a chasm. It was a space wide enough to let a spark take root, faint but alive. In those first days, Miriam felt like a leaf caught in unfamiliar wind, cautious, yet trying with all her strength to adapt. Ezekiel's ranch was larger than she had imagined, but stark and stripped of warmth. Each morning, when dawn tapped against the wooden door, she rose to kindle the fire, sweep the kitchen, and wipe the dust from objects that seemed untouched for years. Housework was nothing new to Miriam, but here every gesture carried a new weight. Once cooking had been only duty, never acknowledged. Now, though Ezekiel spoke no words, she felt that each clean dish, each pot of soup filling the air with quiet fragrance, shifted the silence of the house just enough to make it breathe again. At noon, she walked to the small garden out back. The patch of earth was dry, the rose nearly withered. Miriam knelt, hands in the soil, patient as she pulled weeds and propped frail stalks upright. Sweat beaded on her brow, yet what she felt was rare comfort, the chance to tend something with her own hands, planting even the smallest hope. Ezekiel often watched from a distance. He stood at the fence, arms folded, his ash-gray eyes steady on her movements. At first, he had doubted a slight woman could manage such work, but he came to see that her patience and quiet care did more than endure. It softened the edges of land he thought forever harsh. One evening, Ezekiel led a horse into the yard to reset the saddle. Miriam lingered nearby, then asked if he might teach her. He glanced at her, unreadable, then gave a short nod. "Hold the reins like this." His voice low, clipped. She reached out, her fingers clumsy around the thick leather. Ezekiel stepped behind, his frame casting a shadow across her shoulders. He guided the strap with his hand, his rough palm brushing hers. Miriam startled, the reins slipping from her grasp, striking the hard ground with a sharp snap. Her heart pounded, breath unsteady. Ezekiel paused too, his hand suspended in the air. Their eyes locked, caught in a thread neither could shake. No longer strangers, no longer guarded, just a spark, sudden and impossible to hide. Miriam bent quickly to recover the reins, heat rising to her face. Ezekiel cleared his throat and stepped back, gaze turning outward. No words followed, yet the air between them had changed. Later that evening, Miriam brought a basket of vegetables from the garden. As she washed each stem at the basin, Ezekiel stood in the doorway, his eyes lingering on her hands, stained with earth, gentle in their work. He remembered how they had brushed his own, small yet warm, trembling yet strong enough to make him hesitate to let go. Night fell. The ranch sank into silence. Miriam sat by her window, staring into the dark sweep of prairie. The crescent moon hung above, wind stirring the curtains softly. She pressed her hand to her chest, still unsettled from the afternoon. How could a touch so brief unsettle her so deeply? Perhaps because it had been so long since touch meant anything but fear. In the other room, Ezekiel too lay sleepless. He sat before the fading coals, staring at the last flicker. He saw again the moment Miriam's eyes had lifted to his, hesitant, yet speaking a truth she could not voice. He shook his head, as if to drive it away, but he could not deny it. Her presence had begun to shift the rhythm of his silence. The next morning, When Miriam stepped onto the porch with a bucket in her hands, Ezekiel was waiting. He reached out, his voice plain. "Let me." She froze, then nodded softly. As the weight left her arms, her shoulders lightened, but her heart grew heavy with something else. The realization she no longer bore everything alone. It was a small gesture, nothing more. Yet Miriam knew it was from such small beginnings that an unseen bond was quietly taking root. Slow, silent, but steady. The storm struck without warning, as though the Wyoming sky had chosen that moment to unleash all its fury. The wind wailed across the plains, lashing the wooden walls like a whip of ice. Snow thickened until only a few steps away. Nothing could be seen but a shroud of white. Ezekiel drove the stock into the barn, secured the shutters, and dropped the heavy bar across the main door. "No one goes out until it passes," he said, voice even but heavy. Miriam nodded, pulling her worn shawl close, listening to the storm's cry seep through the cracks. Inside, only the fire held back the cold. Miriam sat near the hearth, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the flames as though searching for a harbor for her restless heart. Ezekiel sat across, his shadow long against the wall, as silent as a living monument. For a long while neither spoke. Only the crack of wood and the howling wind filled the space between them. Miriam knew without the storm, Ezekiel would have found some task to busy himself, keeping distance. But now, there was no escape. She drew breath, her voice low, nearly swallowed by the fire. "Once, I thought I'd never sit by a fire with a man again." Ezekiel lifted his eyes, gray as ash, faintly stirred. Miriam went on. "My husband is gone. But for years, I didn't truly have a husband, only a man who treated me like a possession. I learned silence. I learned how to leave no trace. He never struck my face, only the places no one would see. He called it teaching. I called it survival." The room seemed to tighten under the weight of the truth. Miriam pressed her lips together, waiting for pity, for a sigh, for something that would reduce her story to shame. But Ezekiel only sat still, his hand tightening on his knee. Then he said quietly, "I know what it is to be taught, in another way." He turned his gaze to the fire, his voice low as the faraway wind. "At war, I held a rifle at 18, a boy soldier, thinking himself a hero. But the things I saw, the things I did, no lash could compare. Nights still come with screams, men I shot, friends and enemies both. When the war ended, I came home, but the silence of these plains never drowned the gunfire in my head." He stopped, his hands clasped tight, as though to steady their tremor. Miriam studied him, seeing in his eyes not only hardness, but fractures cut deep, never healed. "Perhaps," she whispered, "we both carry wounds no one can see." Ezekiel looked up. His eyes met hers, not the guarded glance of days past, but recognition, as if two wanderers had found each other's tracks on the same road. The fire snapped, throwing gold across their faces. Miriam pulled her shawl closer, but not from the cold. Her heart hammered as Ezekiel spoke again, his voice low but steady. "You're stronger than I thought." Stronger than I ever was. At times Miriam gave a faint, dry smile, eyes turning back to the flames. Strong. I only survived. But, Surviving. That isn't living. Ezekiel was silent a beat, then spoke slowly, his words like weight laid firm upon the air. Maybe, here, we can learn another way. Not just to survive. The quiet returned, but it was no longer the silence of distance. It was the silence of two souls finding an echo in one another. Outside, the storm still raged, but within, the walls of solitude had cracked just enough to let in a glimmer of light. Miriam looked at Ezekiel once more. In his eyes, she no longer saw a stranger, but a man battling shadows of his own. And for the first time since setting foot on this land, the fire in that empty house did not feel cold. That morning, Ezekiel hitched the wagon out front. The wooden wheels groaned as they rolled, dust rising in the pale light of dawn. Miriam stood on the porch steps, her brown cloak drawn tight around her shoulders, one hand clutching the strap of a small cloth bag. It was her first time leaving the ranch since arriving in this strange land. The trip was only for salt, nails, and a few sacks of flour. Yet to Miriam it felt like a trial, a reckoning with eyes she had never met. "Town's not far," Ezekiel said, as he offered his hand to help her up. "Half a day." Miriam gave a small nod. Her hand rested on the cold wood, trembling slightly, but Ezekiel's steady gaze didn't waver until she was settled. Then the wagon rolled forward, slow across the rough road, past scattered birch trees and fields of gray grass bending like tired waves. All along the way, Ezekiel spoke little. He was not a man of words. Yet Miriam noticed, from the corner of her eye, that he glanced at her now and then, his eyes pausing on the hands folded tight against her cloak. She did not meet his gaze, kept her silence. Still, inside her chest, unease stirred, not only for the town ahead, but also for the man seated solidly beside her. When the first buildings rose at the end of the road, Miriam drew a long breath. Willow Creek was small, a blackened chimney over the smithy, a low-roofed general store, a saloon leaking rough laughter, and a brick church standing quiet at the far end. But the moment their wagon stopped, Miriam felt the weight of dozens of eyes. Men outside the saloon lifted their heads, cigarettes dangling, following her every step. Women at the market pulled their skirts close, whispering behind tilted heads. Children darted in play, then froze when they saw her, their round eyes staring as if she were some strange thing carried in by the wind. Miriam's heart thudded. She heard the whispers clearly. A colored woman, with Holt. He brought her to the ranch? Never seen the like in Willow Creek. Each word struck like a stone against the thin shell she tried to hold around herself. Her shoulders stiffened, her gaze dropped to her worn shoes. Memories surged, markets in another town, the mocking stares, the laughter that trailed her like a curse. Ezekiel climbed down first, then turned and offered his hand. Miriam hesitated, but his palm was already waiting. Almost without thinking, she placed hers in it. The warmth of his grip steadied her, and when he tightened slightly to guide her down, she realized her hand no longer trembled. He stood beside her, broad frame shifting closer, a shield without words. His eyes swept the street, cold and sharp, and the few men who had smirked quickly turned away. Inside the general store, the gray-haired shopkeeper stiffened for a breath at the sight of her, then nodded to Ezekiel and went about business as usual. Miriam exhaled in relief, her fingers shaking as she received the sack of flour. A simple exchange, yet it affirmed something rare, that she was still treated as human. Outside, as they stepped back into the street, Miriam caught another look. A middle-aged woman stood near the church porch, her daughter's small hand in hers. The woman did not whisper, did not turn away. She nodded once, a faint smile touching her lips. The little girl clung to her mother's hand, eyes wide with curiosity, but free of malice. Miriam's heart stirred. That small nod was like a drop of sweetness in a desert. Amid the stares and whispers, one person had chosen quiet kindness. Ezekiel seemed to notice too. He glanced sideways, saw the tremor at Miriam's mouth, as though she nearly smiled. She lowered her head quickly, hiding it. But he knew the smile was not for the town, but for the fragile hope just offered. On the road back, the wagon rolled slow across the dirt track. Miriam sat still, her eyes on the plains, but something in her fear had loosened. The whispers still echoed in memory, yet they no longer pressed so hard. Instead, it was the nod from the church porch that lingered, brighter than the scorn. Ezekiel held the reins, his eyes fixed forward. Then he spoke, his voice rough but steady. "They'll get used to it." Miriam turned her head slightly. His face stayed forward, gray eyes shadowed, his grip firm on the reins, as if his words were not comfort, but promise. She gave no reply, only pulled her cloak tighter. Yet beneath the cloth, her hand had stopped shaking. Beyond the road, the snow was beginning to melt on the fields, and from the thawed ground, green shoots pressed upward. Miriam understood then. Perhaps she was no different. Fragile, yet capable of rising, so long as she had a place to stand and someone to walk beside her. The blizzard came again, fiercer than before. The wind shrieked as if to tear the roof away, hurling fistfuls of white against the windows. Ezekiel had bolted the doors tight, wedged timbers into the latch. Yet the storm pressed through every crack, a long, mournful howl that would not cease. Inside, the fire roared, casting its glow against the wooden beams, holding back the cold. Miriam sat on a thick rug before the hearth, wrapped in a blanket. Ezekiel added another log to the flames, then lowered himself across from her. The golden light carved the lines of age deep into his face, but it also lent his ash-gray eyes a rare softness. For a long time they sat in silence, listening to the storm's fury and the crack of burning wood. At last, Miriam's voice broke the stillness. "When I was a girl, I used to dream of having a garden." Ezekiel looked at her. Miriam's gaze stayed on the fire, her words steady but shadowed with longing. "Not a big one, just a corner with flowers, a few rows of vegetables. But growing up, I never had land to call my own. Everywhere I went, I was only passing through. That dream never came true." She gave a faint, bitter smile. Ezekiel nodded slowly. "I once dreamed of going far. As a young man, I thought war would carry me to new places. But all it left were sleepless nights and memories that won't leave." Their eyes met. In that glance, Miriam no longer saw the hard rancher bound to barren soil, but the boy he once was, whose dreams had been stripped by life's storms. The room sank into stillness again. Miriam pulled the blanket closer, then breathed out softly. "I've never felt safe in a man's arms." Not once Ezekiel stilled. Her confession cut through his defenses like a blade of truth. He stared at his own hands, calloused, scarred, hands that had held rifles and caused hurt. Then his voice came low and rough. "Miriam, if you'll allow me, I'd like to change that." She turned, her dark eyes wide. Outside, the wind roared, but inside, the silence of waiting was stronger. Her heart pounded, and then she gave the smallest nod, fragile yet firm. Ezekiel shifted closer, his hand reaching out, hesitant as if afraid to break her. His palm trembled when it touched hers. Miriam flinched, but did not withdraw. Instead, she let him hold her. Her small hand rested inside his broad one, and in that moment, something gave way. The wall of loneliness within them both. Ezekiel pulled the blanket higher and wrapped his arm around her. Miriam leaned her head against his chest, hearing the strong, steady thrum of his heart, a drumbeat steadying the storm. His breath warmed her hair, and for the first time she felt protected, not out of duty, but out of choice. They stayed that way for a long time, letting the storm rage. The firelight cast their joined shadows against the wall, two forms pressed close, inseparable. Miriam closed her eyes and whispered, so softly it might have been lost in the wind. "Thank you for letting me know what this feels like." Ezekiel's arms tightened, a vow without words. That night, closeness did not end with an embrace. Trembling but unafraid, hesitant yet unhurried, they gave to each other what they had never dared dream of. Miriam opened herself to be touched. Ezekiel opened himself to give. No more shadows of the past, no lash, no gunfire. Only the slow tenderness of two lost souls who had found one another. While the storm raged on, they discovered another kind of peace, not born of silence, but of harmony. Upon the worn wooden floor, under the glow of firelight, they clung together like pieces of a life finally made whole. The night stretched on, snow falling heavy outside, but in that cabin, Miriam for the first time slept in a man's arms without fear. And Ezekiel, for the first time in years, felt the warmth of another's breath beside him like a flame that would not die. The first light of day slipped through the cracks of the window, falling across the worn wooden floor. The storm's howl had faded, leaving only a faint whistle against the eaves. Miriam opened her eyes and found herself still within Ezekiel's arms, his warmth wrapped around her, his steady breath close at her ear. She closed her eyes again for a heartbeat, needing to be sure this was not a dream. For the first time in years, she did not wake in dread. No angry gaze, no heavy voice barking orders, only stillness, and the solid arm around her as if to say the storm had stayed outside. Ezekiel stirred. He opened his eyes and realized his hand lay across a woman's shoulder. A man long accustomed to solitude, now unsettled by the discovery. Yet he did not draw back. Miriam turned toward him, her dark eyes shining in the soft morning light, as if sharing a secret just revealed. They said nothing, only looked at one another. Miriam lowered her face, her lips curving in a fragile smile. Ezekiel gave a small nod, his gaze gentle, softer than it had ever been. She rose, blanket draped around her, hair spilling loose across her shoulders. Ezekiel moved to stoke the fire, his motions slow, awkward, like a man doing something unfamiliar for another's sake. Flames leapt again, chasing away the last chill of the night. At the table, he poured coffee. The hiss of hot liquid filling the tin cup sounded plain but comforting. He set it before her, steam curling upward. "Thank you," she murmured, voice rough with weariness, yet warm in a way new to him. He nodded, eyes averted, though the corner of his mouth lifted faintly. A clumsy smile, fleeting as first light, but enough to ease Miriam's heart. They sat across the table in silence. Miriam sipped, the bitterness giving way to a subtle sweetness that lingered on her tongue, the warmth spreading through her chest like the memory of his arms. When she set the cup down, her hand brushed his resting nearby. Both paused, aware, yet neither pulled away. Ezekiel turned his palm, laying it gently atop hers. No pressure, no claim, just touch. And in that touch was more than any spoken vow. Miriam lifted her gaze and found his eyes, no longer shadowed, but lit with a quiet trembling, like a man learning trust for the first time. They shared breakfast, bread, cheese, small, unremarkable things. Yet Ezekiel nudged the crumbs her way, a small, awkward care. When Miriam's soft laugh slipped free, he shifted in unease but could not hide the gentleness in his eyes. Later, she stepped onto the porch, cloak pulled tight. The prairie lay brilliant beneath the sun, snow glittering like shards of glass. She breathed deep, lungs full of cold, her heart strangely warm. Ezekiel joined her, standing near, not too close yet not apart. He followed her gaze without question, as if he already knew. A light gust stirred her scarf. Ezekiel reached out, adjusting it across her shoulders. The motion was natural, as though he had done it 100 times, though it was their first. Miriam tilted her head slightly, receiving the care, and whispered, "You've changed, Ezekiel." He was quiet, then answered low, "Maybe. I've only found again what I lost too long ago." That evening, she moved about the kitchen preparing supper, while Ezekiel sat at the table peeling potatoes. Now and then his eyes lingered on her slight figure, not as a guest anymore, not as a shadow of the past, but as a part of the home itself. Night fell. They sat again by the fire, Miriam sewing a worn scarf, Ezekiel carving a small bird from a block of wood. When he placed it in her hands, he muttered, "I'm no craftsman, but I hope you'll keep it." Miriam smiled, her eyes bright in the firelight. In that moment, they both understood. No oath, no grand words were needed. A smile, a touch, a cup of coffee, a rough carving. These were enough to bind two lives once broken. Miriam turned toward the window. The sky stretched clear, the snow shining like silver. A new day had begun, and within her, another dawn had risen. The dawn of a love born quiet, steadfast, and real. That afternoon, the sky turned gray, the wind carrying the chill of lingering snow. Miriam was hanging a blanket on the porch rail when the sound of hooves drifted from the road. A prickle of unease climbed her spine. Ezekiel stepped out from the barn, his eyes narrowing at the dust rising in the distance. A man rode up on a black horse, arrogance in his posture, his long coat flaring with the gusts. When he dismounted, Miriam's chest tightened. She knew that face. Thomas Reed, cousin to her late husband. He had been there at the drunken nights, laughing at her husband's cruelty, tossing sly remarks that made her skin crawl. "Miriam Hayes," he drawled, his gaze sweeping coldly over her. "Heard tell you've set yourself up here, living with some lonely Holt." "Clever. But what about the Reed name? Think you can outrun it?" Miriam stepped back, clutching her cloak. Her throat dried, memories clawing to life, The suffocating rooms, the harsh laughter, the rough hand of her husband. Her knees threatened to buckle. Ezekiel moved forward, placing himself between her and Reed. His eyes darkened, his voice low and coarse. "She has nothing to do with the Reeds." "Leave," Thomas spat, his laugh sharp. "And you think your word carries weight, Holt? A black widow living on this land. Sooner or later, she'll pay. I came not just to claim, but to remind her. She'll never be free." Miriam shuddered, chains she thought broken tightening again around her throat. In that moment, Ezekiel drew his revolver. The motion was swift, steady, the barrel leveled at Thomas's chest. The wind seemed to hush, time freezing. His voice cut through, cold as steel. "This is the last time I'll say it. Ride out, before your horse carries you home dead." Thomas swallowed hard, fury flickering in his eyes. For a moment, he measured the man before him, then spat on the dirt and swung back into the saddle. "Wait and see, Holt. Her past will catch her yet." He kicked the horse, leaving a trail of dust behind. Silence dropped heavy. Ezekiel lowered the gun, his shoulders easing as the danger passed. He turned, saw Miriam clinging to the porch post, her face pale, her body trembling. "Miriam," he said softly. She shook her head, stepping back. "He's right. I thought I was free, but that shadow still owns me." Ezekiel stepped closer, but she retreated further, fear burning in her eyes as though a single touch might drag her back into hell. He gripped the gun, then slid it back into its holster. His voice came low, steady. "He won't return." "Not while I'm here." Miriam looked at him, lips trembling, but fear still clouded her gaze. She turned, fled inside, the slam of her door echoing through the hall. Ezekiel stood on the porch, listening to her hurried steps, the sound striking him deeper than any bullet. Night fell. The fire burned in the hearth, but Miriam did not emerge. She sat on her bed, clutching a pillow, heart pounding, with the echo of Thomas's voice, the ghost of her husband's shadow. Though Ezekiel had stood guard, though his gun had promised protection, the past still wrapped itself around her like iron chains. Ezekiel remained outside, pacing the porch, eyes set on the dark. He knew a gun could drive off an enemy, but it could not erase scars carved deep within. And that was the true battle, one no bullet could end. The night air chilled. Inside, Miriam trembled through broken sleep, haunted by dreams where her husband's figure blurred with Thomas's sneer. Again and again, she woke slick with sweat, chest heaving. Each time she heard the heavy steps of Ezekiel outside her door, back and forth, a silent vigil. He did not sleep, only kept watch, making certain she would not face her ghosts alone. That morning, Willow Creek stirred with an unusual clamor. Hooves thundered along the main road, a cloud of dust rolling in their wake. Miriam and Ezekiel had just stepped out of the general store when a shout split the air. Turning, Miriam froze. Thomas Reed had returned. He sat proud atop his black horse, eyes sweeping the crowd with contempt, his shrill voice carrying down the street. "That woman belongs to the Reed name. She has no right to stand here like some fine lady, let alone tie herself to Holt." A crowd gathered quickly, curious stares sharpened into tension. Miriam trembled, retreating a step, clutching her cloak so tightly her knuckles whitened. In that moment, she felt herself pulled back into the frightened girl she once was, dragged into view beneath hostile eyes, nowhere to hide. Ezekiel stepped forward, tall frame shielding her. His voice rang out, steady and cold. Enough, Reed. Miriam Hayes is no longer yours to claim. She is my lawful wife. On this land, she has the same rights as any other. Gasps rippled through the crowd. To speak such words, before the whole town, was no small thing. It was a public declaration of bond. Thomas sneered. Lawful wife? Who witnessed it? Who recognizes it? A black widow daring to stand equal among the white folk of Willow Creek. Miriam's throat clenched, the words cutting like blades. Just as her knees threatened to give, a voice rose from the crowd. I witnessed, a middle-aged woman said, the same one who had smiled at Miriam outside the church. I've seen how Holt treats her. Better than many men treat their wives. Another woman stepped forward, eyes hard. We've all seen enough of drunk men beating women. Today I see a man who stands to protect her. A murmur spread, shifting like a tide. Several women nodded, drawing their children closer to Miriam, as though to show she would not stand alone. Color rose hot on Thomas's face. He roared, You're all bewitched. She's not worthy. But Ezekiel's voice cut across his fury, thunder in its weight. Enough! Speak one more word against her, and you'll find no place left in this town. The air tightened, brittle as glass. Thomas scanned the faces around him, but the crowd no longer bent to his side. Some women looked on with open disdain. Some men stood with folded arms, unwilling to back his quarrel. At last, Thomas spat, fury boiling, and jerked his reins. You'll regret this. One day, the shame will swallow you whole. He lashed his whip. The horse reared and bolted, leaving only dust in his wake. Silence followed. Miriam stood still, eyes brimming. Ezekiel turned and saw her face streaked with tears. Miriam, he murmured, his broad hand resting gently on her shoulder. She looked from him to the women who still lingered nearby. None turned away. Some nodded, their smiles cautious yet real. Miriam's tears fell, not from fear, but from something deeper. For the first time, she felt seen. Not as someone's wife, not as a shadow hidden away, but as herself. A person with a name, with worth, with the right to stand tall. Ezekiel's hand tightened on her shoulder. He spoke no comfort, for none was needed. Her tears themselves were proof of a turning point. She was no longer living only to survive. She was being recognized for who she truly was. On the road home, Miriam sat beside Ezekiel, her hands resting quietly in her lap. The wind carried dust and the dry scent of grass, but for once it did not feel heavy. It smelled like the start of something new. She turned her head toward Ezekiel. His eyes stayed on the road, reins firm in his hand, yet his free hand slid to rest atop hers. No words passed. The gesture was enough. From that day, neither of them would stand alone, not in life, nor before the eyes of the world. The news came on a late winter morning. Miriam stood in the wooden kitchen, her hands resting lightly over her belly, her eyes shimmering with both wonder and unease. When Ezekiel stepped inside, shaking snow from his heavy coat, she hesitated before speaking words she had carried for days. Ezekiel, I think I'm with child. The room stilled. He froze, one glove slipping from his hand to the floor. In his ash-gray eyes, surprise rippled into something more tangled. Fear, trembling awe, and the faint glimmer of unexpected light. Miriam bit her lip, waiting. She feared rejection, feared he would see the child as burden. But Ezekiel did not look away. At last, his voice came rough, breaking slightly. "Our child." From that moment, the ranch changed. Miriam moved slower, often sitting by the window with one hand resting over her stomach as she sewed. Ezekiel worked harder, checking the barns, cutting extra wood, hauling home sacks of seed. He spoke little, but his unease showed in every motion. One evening, after chores were done, Ezekiel sat alone on the porch. Miriam came to him, draping a scarf around his shoulders. His hand brushed hers, his eyes searching. "Miriam, I don't know if I'm fit to be a father." She paused. In him still lingered the shadows of war, the rifle, the screams, the memories unspoken. He feared the hands that once dealt death could not be gentle enough for life. Miriam sat beside him, folding her smaller hand over his. "No one is ever truly ready, Ezekiel. But you've kept me safe. You've shown me what it means to be unafraid. This child will know love, because it will have a father who knows loss and knows how to treasure what remains." Ezekiel studied her for a long while. His eyes shone wet in the lamplight. That night, when Miriam lay in bed, he sat beside her. Hesitant, he pressed his ear against her belly. In the quiet, he listened as if searching for the faint stir of life. His vision blurred, his broad shoulders trembled, and for the first time Miriam saw him weep. "All my life I had nothing to hold on to." His voice cracked. "Now I do." Miriam's hand slid through his hair, her heart brimming. She clasped his hand tight, her gaze steady, soft as candlelight. "Then let's hold it together, Ezekiel. The both of us." He lifted his head, ash-gray eyes rimmed with tears, but alight with something new: faith. He was no longer the man who lived shut inside his past. He had found reason to move forward. A family, a piece of life he had never dared dream. From then on, each day bore a different hue. Ezekiel labored with new care. Each swing of axe and lift of plow made for the home soon to cradle another. Miriam planted seeds in the thawing garden, sometimes pausing with a quiet smile when she caught him watching from a distance. They needed no grand promises. A hand laid across the table, a scarf adjusted in the evening wind, an embrace before sleep. Such small gestures were enough to weave two broken lives into the fabric of a family, awaiting its fullness. Outside, spring began to stir. Snow melted, streams murmured to life. And within the Holt Ranch, a new heartbeat grew. Proof that the past had closed, and the dawn ahead belonged to all three. The days after winter passed slow, sweet, and heavy. Miriam's belly grew round, and with the joy of waiting came her body's weariness. Each morning she rose with effort, one hand pressed to the wooden wall for support, her breath short. At times, a few steps to the porch left her pausing, hand on her stomach, waiting for her heart to steady. By night, backaches kept her from sleep, and she sat for hours by the window, rubbing her taut belly in quiet comfort. Ezekiel watched with a heart tight as wire. He had known labor, known burden, but never this kind of fragile fear. At night, when Miriam drifted into fitful rest, he lay awake beside her, staring at her small figure curled on her side, one hand on her belly as if shielding it. In his chest a question beat again and again. If I lose her, what remains of me? One midday, with snow dripping from the eaves, Miriam fainted while hanging laundry. The thud of falling cloth sent Ezekiel running. He caught her in his arms, so light, her breath thin as thread. Laying her on the bed, his hands shook so badly he could hardly unlace her shoes. When she stirred and whispered weakly that she was all right, he bent low, burying his face in her hand, letting tears streak his weathered cheek. "I cannot lose you," he rasped, a prayer more than a vow. Her lips pale, Miriam still managed a small, steady smile. "You won't. We have a child to raise together." From that day, Ezekiel scarcely left her side. He shouldered every task, hauling water, chopping wood, tending the animals, fumbling even with the cooking. Each time Miriam tried to rise, he was there, his broad hand closing gently around hers. Once, when she teased that he was becoming her shadow, he only murmured, "If that's what it takes to keep you safe, then so be it." News of the child spread through Willow Creek. Those who once doubted began leaving small gifts: a basket of milk, skeins of wool, a sack of vegetables, even a pouch of bread left quietly on the porch. One afternoon, the same middle-aged woman who had once spoken up in town came to sit with Miriam, sewing baby clothes and sharing stories of her own children. Miriam smiled through her fatigue, realizing at last they were not alone. Ezekiel stayed cautious, his eyes wary at strangers crossing his threshold. But when he saw Miriam glowing with warmth in the circle of women, when laughter lifted in their kitchen, he loosened his guard. One evening he leaned against the porch post, watching Miriam among them, her hand smoothing her round belly. In that moment, he knew the house had found true warmth, not only from love, but from the community that now held them. Still, fear clung to him. At night, Ezekiel often sat beside her bed, his hand resting on her belly, feeling the faint stirrings within. Each kick was a reminder. This fragile life depended on him being strong enough to hold both. Once, as the child moved more forcefully, he pressed his ear against her stomach, voice breaking. "I never prayed before, but now each night, I beg for you and the child to be safe." Miriam stirred, clasping his hand, her eyes soft as the firelight. "You don't have to bear it alone. I am here, and the town is here. We are not alone anymore." Her words lifted a weight from his shoulders. For the first time, Ezekiel understood. Love was not guarding in silence at all costs. It was letting others share the burden, letting light in to scatter the dark. Spring touched the land at last. Snow melted, grass spread green across the fields, and sparrows returned to the fence with song. Miriam moved slowly, her body frail, yet her eyes shone with trust. Ezekiel still hovered, steadying her at each step, but now he carried a strength beyond his own, the strength of her faith, of the hands that reached to help, and of the small heartbeat he heard each night. The trial was not over, but they no longer walked its shadowed path alone. With community beside them, a home around them, and a love deep enough to endure loss, they faced whatever lay ahead together. That morning came with the first breath of summer. The fields around Willow Creek shimmered in fresh green, the sky wide and bright, the air warm with promise. But inside the Holt ranch house, another kind of storm raged, a storm of pain, endurance, and hope. Miriam lay on the bed, her brow drenched in sweat, dark curls plastered to her temple. Her hand gripped the worn quilt as waves of contraction shook her body. Beside her, Ezekiel held fast to her trembling hand, his gray eyes stricken. He had faced war, the sound of rifles and the fall of men, but never this kind of helpless terror, the fight of the woman he loved as she wrestled with life itself to bring forth another. Footsteps rushed on the porch. The women of the town had come, guiding, wiping her brow, offering gentle words. One placed a warm cloth in Ezekiel's hands, urging him to steady her. He obeyed clumsily, careful as if each stroke might decide her fate. Miriam leaned into his chest, hearing the hammering of his heart. Time bent into long minutes. The sun rose higher, light spilling through the small window onto Miriam's pale face. Then, at last, the air broke with a sharp, ringing cry, high and clear, cutting through the heavy silence. Tears streamed down Miriam's cheeks as the small, red child was laid on her chest. A daughter with damp black hair and tiny fists reaching for warmth. Ezekiel bent low, his broad shoulders trembling as his rough hand brushed the infant's. For a man who had once known only destruction, this fragile grasp undid him. "A girl," the midwife whispered, her voice thick. Miriam looked to her husband, voice faint yet radiant. "Ezekiel, our daughter." His hand closed tightly around hers. Tears slipped down his weathered face, not of defeat, but of a man who had finally found something worth keeping. The days after were filled with new sound, no longer the stillness of a lonely house, but the tender cries of a newborn. Miriam, weary but glowing, rocked the child and sang lullabies she had never dared sing before. Ezekiel stumbled through the tasks of fatherhood, lighting fires, cooking porridge, fumbling with cloth diapers, his scarred hands trembling as though the baby were spun from glass. Yet each time her tiny fingers curled around his, courage bloomed where fear once dwelled. The community, too, became part of this legacy. Neighbors left gifts, fresh milk, baskets of vegetables, hand-woven blankets. Women who once whispered doubts now came to cradle the child, offering blessings instead of suspicion. Miriam wept softly at their kindness, realizing she no longer bore the weight of scorn, but was held in welcome arms. One quiet evening, Miriam carried the baby to the porch. Ezekiel joined her, his arms settling around her shoulders as they looked toward the horizon, golden in the fall of day. No words were needed. The wind carried the scent of grass, the insects hummed their chorus, and the warmth of family filled the silence. Ezekiel gazed at his daughter, then at Miriam. He saw not the battlefield of his past, but the journey they had walked. Two broken souls, once wandering in shadows, now bound by light. Here in this simple home he had found his legacy, peace, love, and a family to outlast him. Miriam leaned her head to his shoulder, her voice faint yet sure, carried in the dusk. Love, even when it comes late, is strong enough to heal every wound. Ezekiel's arm tightened gently. For the first time in years, he did not see the future as a void. Instead, it stretched wide as the prairie before them, an open field glowing with promise. On that weathered porch, with the sun setting and the prairie whispering, 3 lives sat together. Their family was small, but whole, and in the hush of twilight, it was as if the land itself spoke, reminding all who would listen that love, when true, could turn loss into hope and scars into a legacy of healing. Dear friends, the story of Miriam and Ezekiel does not close with the clash of guns or the bitterness of feud, but with the cry of a child and the quiet of a prairie evening. Perhaps that is the dream many of us hold, that after long years, love still arrives, gentle yet strong enough to mend. Does late-found love still carry the power to heal? Share your thoughts with us in the comments. And if this story touched you, please like, subscribe, and ring the bell to continue walking with us through more warm-hearted Wild West love stories.